to begin with, you're going to start out with a pencil outline of all the shadows. So form shadow, cast shadow, and I've slightly outlined where the reflective light's going to occur. You also want to go ahead and put in that outline or that line to separate the background from the foreground. So you can use any color. I'm going with the magenta plus some blue plus some black. And I'm working on the darker side first. And I just want to point out, you don't want to have the darker side take up half of the space. You want it to take up less than half. So maybe a third of your sphere is dedicated to the darker form shadow. And you do kind of want to think about wrapping your mark around the sphere. And as it goes towards the middle, it should start to fade a little bit. Actually working on the underpainting, some colors like the magenta, the ultramarine, the yellow, they'll start out and they'll be a little bit transparent when you're starting out. So you can see through to the paper beneath. And we're going to have to go back and cover that with multiple coats. And that's really why it's so important to keep painting and layering one on top of the other. What you don't want is transparent passages that you can see through to the paper beneath. You want it to look solid. That's how you'll get a professional, more realistic painting. And this is exactly the same kind of process as when you were interpreting the gradient. It is a gradient too, except for we're curving our line, we're wrapping that line around that sphere, around that ball. So I'm just going to go ahead and start to introduce a little bit of reflected light. The thing about reflected light is you don't want it to go the same shade as a midtone. It needs to be darker than the midtone, but lighter than the form shadow. So I added a tiny smidge of white to the that kind of violet color there. And again, this is just the underpainting. We're going to be layering on top. And then I'm transitioning straight to the magenta there. And again, it's transparent, so I'll hit that up with another layer in a little bit. Okay, so I've sped this up a little bit, but I'm painting and I'm considering like the form and how the paint marks kind of wrap around that form. So I'm transitioning to that magenta. The magenta is going to transition to a little bit of a lighter color, so I'll make it more of a tint there. I'll add a drop of white into the magenta to get it to shift. And there's where the shift is starting to occur. And if it looks a little bit stripy at first, that's not the end of the world. We'll be blending and working on like those bridges in between the values because you'll have to hit it up with a second coat today regardless. So that white patch, that's where the highlight is going to be. So we are going to paint that in, it just needs to be lighter. And again, you want it to be a smooth shift from one value to the next. So I did work this a little bit more off camera, and now I'm going to the cast shadow. So if you look at your reference, your cast shadow should be darker than the sphere, than the form itself. So I'm using black, white, and a little bit of blue to get that. So it's not pure black, it's like a really dark gray with a little bit of blue. And as it goes out, it's going to get lighter towards the edge, just a little bit, not a lot, but just a little bit. If you look at the direction of the paint strokes, you want to go sideways, so horizontally, to make it feel like your cast shadow is being stretched out. To the left, it's actually a little bit lighter. That tiny bit of cast shadow you see to the left side, that's a little bit lighter than to the right. And I'm lightening the edges there a bit. I added a little bit of color to the edge as well, just to transition it. and I'm blocking in kind of a chunky, little bit sloppy foreground. So this is like the tabletop. I made kind of a brown color. And you want to think of your cast shadow as an oval shape, like like your sphere is sitting directly on top of an oval. And then I need to go back in and kind of clean up the edges on that cast shadow a little bit more. And then you're going to block in a background. And I'd like you to follow the same value scheme that you see in the picture, but you can add some color to it. Mine is black, white, and yellow. I didn't want the background to detract from that really bright, magenta ball there, that sphere. So I went with more like neutral, so the black, white, and yellow. It gives it some flavor, but it's not overpowering. It's not like I'm doing an emerald green background that's going to take away from the ball. And then you do kind of have to push up to the sides. So I'm letting the background be a little bit loose. The ball, that can be tight, that can be smooth shifts in value. But the background, I'm working kind of what's a method called wet into wet. So it's still wet, so I can push the paint one value into another. Um, so it is okay to get a little bit messy. You still want to have some control of your brush when you do that. You don't want to accidentally go into the sphere, but it is okay to be a little bit looser in the background. I think that's really kind of an attractive quality in a painting when you can get kind of loose in the background and the object itself, the focal point, is in focus. So it is lighter on the right hand side of the background, darker to the left. Right there, I'm just cleaning up the edges a little bit. It is a good idea to kind of paint back in the edges with the magenta. What's even cooler is if you can get some edges to blur. You don't need it to blur all over, but right now the edge is pretty sharp. If you get the edge of your sphere wet and take the same paint that you use for the background and put those two side by side, edge to edge, then you'll get a soft edge. And I keep playing with it. I played with it for a while. It's actually kind of fun to play with the background because it's so loose. I painted it multiple times, both sides. Okay, and lastly, I just popped in a highlight, so it looks like it's more reflective. So I popped in a white plus a little bit of yellow, and I kind of blended it in a little bit off camera.